The first thing she heard wasn't the engines. It was the fence posts snapping, one after another, like gunshots across 40 years of her life. By the time the widow reached her porch, 3 lifted trucks were already tearing through the wheat her late husband had planted the spring before he died. The young men behind the wheels were laughing, filming it. One of them waved at her, and she stood there, 71 years old, alone, watching everything she had left get ground into the mud. What none of them knew, what the man who paid them didn't know, was that she'd once shown a small kindness to a stranger on a broken-down motorcycle. And that stranger had 100 brothers. Before we go any further, I want to know where in this great country you're watching from. This story happened in a quiet Kentucky valley, but folks tune in from every corner of the map. So do me a favor and drop your state in the comments right now. Let me see where all my good people are sitting tonight. Georgia, Ohio, Texas, the Carolinas. Wherever you are, pour yourself a cup of coffee and settle in, because you're going to want to hear this one all the way through. Now, let me take you back to the beginning, to 120 acres of stubborn Kentucky ground, a widow who asked nothing of anybody, and one small kindness she'd long forgotten she ever showed. Because to understand how 100 of the most feared men in America came thundering up her gravel lane, you first have to understand exactly what she stood to lose, and exactly who decided she was standing in his way. The name she was given at birth was Wanda, and for 71 years she had answered to it in this same valley, under this same wide Kentucky sky. On the morning our story begins, she was already awake before the sun had fully cleared the ridge line, the way she had been every morning for as long as she could remember. Some habits are older than the reasons we keep them. She carried her coffee out to the porch in the same chipped enamel mug she'd used for 30 years, and she sat in the same wicker chair that had softened and sagged to the exact shape of her. The boards beneath her feet were worn pale in 2 places. One where she stepped, and one where her husband used to. Elwood had built this porch with his own hands the summer they married, back when the 2 of them had nothing but each other and 120 acres of stubborn ground that everyone said would never come to anything. They made it come to something. 46 years of rising before dawn, of frost and drought, and the kind of debt that keeps a person up at night. 46 years of turning that stubborn ground into a living, breathing farm. And then, for springs back, Elwood had gone out to plant the winter wheat the way he did every year, and he had come in early complaining of a tightness in his chest, and by morning he was gone. Just like that. The wheat he'd planted came up green and gold that season all the same, waving in the wind over the man who would never see it. She had let it grow. She let it grow every year now. She could not bring herself to do anything else. The tomatoes were hers. Those she tended alone, long rows of them heavy and red by high summer. And every Saturday she loaded her truck and drove them to the county market, where folks had come to know her plants were the sweetest for miles. It was not much of an income. It was enough. Before she went out to the fields that morning, she did something she did most mornings without quite knowing why. She opened the second drawer beside the kitchen sink, the one that stuck, and she looked down at a folded paper napkin, grease-stained and soft with age, a phone number written across it in a stranger's careful hand. She looked at it for a moment. Then she closed the drawer and went to work. To understand that napkin, you have to go back 6 years, to a July afternoon so hot the air over the county road shimmered like water that wasn't there. Wanda was driving home from the market with an empty truck bed and the windows down, and about a mile from her turnoff she saw him, a big man standing beside a motorcycle at the shoulder of the road, the hood of the engine open, so to speak, and heat rising off the asphalt in waves around him. She was not the first person to pass him. She would learn later that she was something like the 9th or the 10th. Cars had been going by him for the better part of an hour, slowing just enough to get a good look and then speeding right back up. Because he was not a small man, and he was not a clean-cut man. He wore a heavy leather vest even in that heat, and it was covered in patches and pins she did not recognize and did not understand. Winged emblems, strange words, a stitched design across the back that meant nothing to her at all. He had a gray beard and arms like fence posts and the kind of face that people cross streets to avoid. And so they drove past him, one after another, and left him standing in the sun. Wanda pulled over. She didn't think much about it, to tell the truth. She only knew that it was near 100 degrees and a human being was stranded, and that was the whole of the arithmetic as far as she was concerned. She had a cooler in the cab with a ham sandwich she hadn't eaten and a thermos of cold water, and she gave him both. She told him to sit in the shade of her truck. And while he waited on a tow that took the better part of 2 hours to arrive, she sat right down beside him on the tailgate and talked to him like he was anybody's neighbor. She never once asked what the patches meant. It never occurred to her that she ought to be afraid. When the tow finally came, he pulled a napkin from his pocket and wrote a number on it in slow, careful handwriting. He pressed it into her hand and said, "If you ever need anything, anything at all, you call me. Doesn't matter when, doesn't matter what." She smiled and thanked him and tucked it away, certain she would never have cause to use it. If you believe a person's worth is measured by how they treat a stranger who can do nothing for them, hit subscribe. The people who drove past her that day don't subscribe to channels like this. We do. Welcome to the family. Now, some miles from Wanda's quiet valley, in a glass office on the top floor of a building he owned outright, there was a man who had never in his life stood stranded on the side of any road. His name was Prescott Vane, and he had made a great deal of money doing the one thing he was truly gifted at, which was seeing a piece of land and imagining it emptied of whatever stood on it. Where you or I might look at a field and see wheat, Prescott Vane looked at a field and saw parking. Where you might see a farmhouse, he saw square footage that could be cleared. He had a way of talking about people's homes as though they were simply obstacles that had not yet been persuaded to move. For the better part of 2 years, he had been quietly assembling something ambitious in that county. A sprawling development, a whole-planned community of retail and townhomes and manicured lots, the kind of project that turns a modest fortune into an enormous one. He had bought up parcel after parcel, farm after farm, some from families who were glad to sell, and some from families who simply grew tired of him asking. Piece by piece, the map on his office wall had filled in with his color. And by the summer our story turns, there was only one square left uncolored. Only one parcel standing between Prescott Vane and the deal of his life. It was 120 acres in a quiet valley, with a hand-built porch and long rows of tomatoes and a field of wheat that a widow refused to plow under. He had approached her the way he approached everyone, which is to say pleasantly, with a firm handshake and a number written on paper that was meant to make a person's breath catch. It was a great deal of money. It was, by any reasonable measure, far more than the land was worth. And Wanda had looked at that number, and looked at that man, and told him no. Not because she was holding out for more. Not because she was playing some shrewd game he could respect. She told him no because her husband had planted that wheat with his own 2 hands in the last spring of his life, and because you cannot put a price on the last thing a man ever gives you. She tried to explain it to him. She spoke of Elwood, and of the porch, and of 46 years. Prescott Vane listened with a patient smile and understood not one word of it. And here is the thing you must know about a man like that, the thing that made him so much more dangerous than someone who shouts. He did not rage when she refused him. He did not slam his fist or raise his voice. He simply smiled and thanked her for her time and drove away down her gravel lane in a car worth more than her house. And he began, quietly, to think about the problem in a different way, because Prescott Vane had never in his life solved a problem with his own hands. He solved problems with other people's hands and other people's desperation and money enough to keep his own fingerprints clean. He had done it many times before, and as he drove away from Wanda's farm that afternoon, he was already deciding whose hands he would use this time. The hands Prescott Vane chose did not belong to hardened men. That was the cleverness of it, and the cruelty of it both. He did not go looking for criminals, because criminals can be traced and criminals can talk. Instead, he went looking for something far more useful to a man in his position. He went looking for young people with too much money, too much time, and nothing in their lives that had ever taught them the word no. He found 3 of them. They were the grown children of families as wealthy as his own, and they had spent their whole lives gliding above the ordinary consequences that shaped the rest of us. The eldest was a young man who had wrecked 2 cars before he was 20 and never once paid for either. The second was his cousin, all easy charm and cold underneath it, the sort who had learned that a family name could smooth over nearly anything. And the third traveled in their orbit the way a smaller planet does, pulled along, going where they went. Prescott Vane did not present it to them as a crime. He would never be so crude. He presented it as fun. He mentioned, over expensive drinks, that he had some raw acreage that needed clearing anyway, and wouldn't it be a laugh to take their lifted trucks out and tear it up a little? A little off-roading, he called it. Some mud, some noise, a good time. and there would be money in it. Enough that they treated the whole arrangement like a dare rather than a job. Nobody's going to miss some dirt, he told them, and they laughed, because to them it truly was only dirt. They had never planted anything. They did not know that ground could be sacred to somebody. They agreed easily, the way people agree to things they will never have to answer for. And yet, this you should hold on to. The third one did not laugh quite as loud as the others. When the plan was laid out and the cousins were already grinning about it, that quieter one sat a moment too long with the drink untouched, and something flickered across that young face that might have been a question. It passed. It was pushed down and away, the way an uncomfortable thought gets pushed down when the people around you have already decided. But it had been there. For just a moment, one of the three had felt the shape of what they were about to do. Remember that. And while all of this was being decided in a room she would never see, Wanda spent that evening the way she spent every evening, knowing nothing of it at all. She came in from the fields as the light went long and golden across the valley, her hands stained from the day's work, her back aching in the familiar places. She washed the tomatoes she'd picked and set them in the wide bowl on the counter. She made herself a simple supper, the way you learn to cook for one when you have spent your life cooking for two, and she ate it slowly at the kitchen table with the radio playing low. Through the window, the wheat stood tall and still in the last of the light, the way Elwood had left it, catching that final gold before the dark came on. After supper she sat out on the porch a while, in the wicker chair worn to her shape, and she watched the fireflies come up out of the grass the way they had every summer of her long life. She was not lonely, exactly. She had made a kind of peace with the quiet. She had her land, and her tomatoes, and the memory of a good man in every board of that house, and she had told herself that was enough, and most days she believed it. She did not know what three young men and their trucks were being paid to do. She did not know that her peace had only hours left to it. She finished her coffee. She rose and reached inside the door and turned off the porch light. She would remember that it was a Tuesday. They came in the gray hour before dawn, when the valley was still and the birds had not yet started, and the first thing Wanda knew of it was the sound. She was asleep when it began. A low, growling rumble that worked its way into her dreams before it pulled her out of them. Diesel engines, more than one, throttling up somewhere close. For a moment she lay there in the dark, her old heart already beating faster than it should, telling herself it was nothing, telling herself it was some truck out on the county road that would pass on by. But it did not pass on by. It grew louder. It grew closer. And then she heard the first fence post go. You do not forget a sound like that if you have lived on a farm. The sharp, splintering crack of seasoned wood snapping under weight. The fence Elwood had set post by post with a hand auger and a level and more patience than most men have. She heard it break, and then another, marching across her land in the dark, and Wanda was up and moving before she had even decided to move, her bare feet on the cold floor, her hands fumbling at the door. When she came out onto that porch she had built her evenings on, she saw the headlights first, 3 sets of them, high off the ground, swinging and bouncing across her fields like something wild let loose. 3 enormous trucks, engines roaring, tearing back and forth through the wheat. Her husband's wheat, the green and gold he had planted in the last spring of his life, that she had let grow every year because she could not bear to do anything else. And they were driving through it, ripping long muddy scars across it, donuts of churned earth where the tall grain had stood only moments before. She screamed. She does not remember deciding to. It simply came out of her, a sound she did not know she still had in her. And she went down those porch steps in her nightgown and into the wet grass, running toward them, waving her arms, screaming at them to stop, to please, please stop. An old woman of 71, alone in the half-dark, running at 3 trucks with nothing but her voice. They saw her. That is the part that matters. They saw her coming, and they did not stop. One of the trucks swung wide through her tomato rows, the long rows she tended alone, heavy and red and nearly ready for Saturday's market, and flattened them into pulp under its tires, row after row, while the young man behind the wheel laughed. Another truck slowed just enough for the boy in the passenger seat to lean out his window with his phone held up, filming her, filming all of it, grinning as he did. And a third rolled past close enough that a hand came out and waved at her, a cheerful, mocking little wave, the way you'd wave at a child. She caught her foot on something in the dark, and she fell. Hard. down into the mud and the ruin of her own field, the wet earth soaking through her nightgown, her palms scraped raw, and she stayed down there on her hands and knees, unable for a moment to rise, while the engines roared on all around her. And her hand came down on something soft in the mud. She looked. It was one of her tomatoes, whole, unbroken, torn from the vine and half pressed into the churned earth. She reached for it. Her fingers closed around it. This small, red, ordinary thing she had grown with her own 2 hands, all that was left in that instant of a whole season's work. And in that stillness, her on her knees in the mud, her hand around that one tomato, the whole world seemed to go silent. Then it all came back at once. The engines, the laughing, the splintering wood, and the tearing earth. It roared back and around her twice as loud as before, and Wanda knelt there in the wreckage of everything Elwood had built, and understood that no one was coming to help her. When the trucks finally roared off down her lane and the dust settled and the silence came back for real this time, Wanda stayed on her knees in the mud a long while before she could stand. And when she did stand, she did the thing you were supposed to do. She went inside on shaking legs, and she called the police, because that is what we are all taught to do when someone has wronged us. We are taught that there is a system and that it will answer. A deputy came out, eventually. He walked her ruined fields with a notepad, and he was not unkind. Exactly. He shook his head at the churned earth and the flattened rows and the broken fence line, and he wrote some things down. She told him everything. She told him about the 3 trucks and the young men, and the phone held out the window filming her. She told him she could describe them, that she had seen their faces, that one of them had waved at her as if it were all a great joke. And the deputy nodded and wrote, and told her they would look into it. But you already know how this goes, because you have lived long enough in the world to know how this goes. The days passed, and nothing happened. The young men, it turned out, had families with names that carried weight in that county, names attached to lawyers, and to the kind of quiet phone calls that get made between important people. What had been done to her was recast, somewhere in an office she would never see, as something smaller than it was. A property dispute, a misunderstanding about a boundary line, some youthful foolishness that had gotten a little out of hand, nothing worth ruining 3 bright young futures over. Papers were shuffled. The matter was, in the language of such things, resolved without charges. The heirs walked away from it without so much as a mark on their records, without a single day of consequence, exactly as they had walked away from everything their whole lives. And here is the part that cut the deepest. That video, the one the boy had filmed leaning out the truck window, of an old woman falling in the mud while they laughed, did not disappear. It went up online, posted like a trophy, passed around among their friends. And the friends laughed. They left their little comments and their little jokes beneath the sight of Wanda on her hands and knees in the ruin of her husband's field. And to them it was funny. To them she was not a person at all. She was content. She was a punchline that would scroll on by and be forgotten by lunch. She saw it. Someone showed her, meaning perhaps to help, and she saw herself down in that mud with strangers laughing at her from behind their screens, and something in her that had held together through 46 years of frost and drought and the loss of the only man she had ever loved. Something in her finally began to break. She went back out to the fields alone. There was no one else. She got down on her knees in the wreck of it, in her work gloves, and she began the impossible task of trying to salvage what she could, one broken plant at a time, an old woman utterly alone against a ruin she had not made and could not undo. No help was coming. The law had shrugged. The men who did it were laughing. And she was 71 years old, out there by herself, trying to lift her whole world up out of the mud with her bare hands. 3 days. That is how long she carried that alone. 3 days of shrugs and smirks and the sound of strangers laughing at her pain. So let me ask you something right here. If you cannot stand the kind of man who buys his way out of everything he breaks, the kind who ruins a person and never once has to answer for it, type "not above the law" in the comments right now. Let's see how many of us are on her side. Because the men who were about to take her side, they didn't shrug. The days after that ran together the way bad days do. Wanda kept going out to the fields because she did not know what else to do with herself, and she kept trying to set things right that could not be set right. And every evening she came in more hollowed out than she had gone out. The wheat was gone. Most of the tomatoes were gone. The fence her husband had built lay broken across the low ground. And the worst of it was not even the ruin itself. It was the knowing that no one would answer for it, that the men who had done it were somewhere out there laughing, and that she was completely, utterly alone against it. She had never in her life felt so small. It was on one of those gray evenings, standing at her kitchen sink with mud still under her fingernails and no more fight left in her, that she opened the second drawer beside the sink, the one that stuck. She was not looking for anything, not really. Or perhaps some part of her had been circling toward it for days without letting the rest of her know. But her hand went to that drawer, and she worked it open, and there it was where it had sat for 6 years. A folded paper napkin, grease-stained and soft with age, a phone number written across it in a stranger's slow and careful hand. If you ever need anything, anything at all, you call me. Doesn't matter when. Doesn't matter what. She stood there holding it for a long time. And every reason not to call rose up in her at once. She barely knew the man. She had shared a sandwich and 2 hours of shade with him 6 years ago and had never once laid eyes on him since. What could she even say? What could a stranger she'd met on the side of a road possibly do about lawyers and important names and a video of her that the whole county seemed to think was funny? She felt foolish even holding the napkin. Who was she to call on a man out of nowhere, after all this time, and lay her troubles at his feet? He had probably forgotten her entirely. He had probably thrown his own number away years ago. But she had nowhere else to turn. Every other door had been closed in her face. And so, with her hands shaking so badly she had to dial the number twice, Wanda picked up the phone and called. It rang, and it rang, and just as she was about to lose her nerve and hang up, a voice answered. Low and rough, and older now than she remembered, but unmistakably his. She hardly knew how to begin. She stumbled over her own words, apologizing for calling, apologizing for bothering him, saying she was sure he didn't even remember her, that it had been years, that it was probably nothing. And then, haltingly, it all came out of her. The trucks, the wheat, her husband's wheat. The tomatoes flattened into the mud and the young men laughing and the phone held out the window, and the police who had done nothing, and the video, and how she was all alone out here trying to lift it up by herself, and she didn't know who else to call. There was a silence on the other end of the line, a long one, and when he finally spoke, he did not ask if she was sure. He did not ask her to prove any of it. He did not offer soft words or tell her it would be all right. He asked her 4 things, low and even and heavy as stone. Which farm? Say it again. She told him. She gave him the name of the valley and the number on the county road, and he had her repeat it once more, slowly, and she heard him say it back to himself as though he were writing it down. And then the line went quiet, and he was gone. She hung up the phone and heard nothing. No promise. No plan. She stood there in her empty kitchen and thought that perhaps she had only made a fool of herself after all. She was wrong. 2 states away, a single text message had just gone out to 100 phones. That night, Wanda barely slept, and when she did, she dreamed of vengeance. She lay awake in the dark of the house Elwood built and turned the phone call over and over in her mind. And the longer she lay there, the more certain she became that nothing would come of it. She had unloaded her troubles onto a stranger, and he had said 8 words and hung up. And what did she expect from that, truly? A woman her age ought to know better than to hope. She told herself, lying there in the quiet, that she would hear nothing more from him, that she had embarrassed herself, and that in the morning she would go back out to the fields and go on trying to salvage what she could, alone, because alone was what she was. She had made her peace with a great many hard things in her life. She would make her peace with this one too. But out beyond the dark of her valley, in places she could not see and could not have imagined, something had already begun to move. It started with that single text message, and then it did not stop. In a garage 2 states away, a man read the words on his phone screen and set down his coffee and did not pick it up again. He made a call. That call became 3 calls, and those 3 became a dozen, and the dozen became more than a person could easily count, spreading out across highways and county lines through the long hours of the night. Men who had never heard the name of a widow in Kentucky learned it that evening, and learned what had been done to her, and needed to hear nothing else. There was no debate. There was no weighing of whether it was their business. One of their own had put out a word, and a woman who had once shown kindness to a brother when the whole world drove past him was alone and in trouble, and for these men, that was the entire beginning and end of the matter. They began, quietly, to rearrange their lives around it. Shifts were traded. Plans were canceled. Bags were packed in the dark while families were told only that something needed doing and that it could not wait. In driveways and side streets across 2 states, one by one, engines that had sat cold began to turn over. A low, waking growl here, another there, and another, scattered points of sound in the night all pointed, though no one in that valley yet knew it, toward the same gravel lane. And while all of that machinery of loyalty was grinding slowly into motion out in the dark, the men who had set this whole thing off were celebrating. Prescott Vane, for his part, considered the matter as good as finished. The widow's fields were ruined, her spirit was broken, and the law had been made to look the other way just as he had known it would. It was, in his experienced view, only a matter of time now before the old woman gave up and sold. And if she did not, well, there were other pressures a patient man could apply. He had already been out to look at her land as though it were his own. He had walked the edge of her broken fields with a rolled set of plans under his arm and a satisfied smile on his face, gesturing at the ruined wheat, describing to the people around him where the entrance road would go, where the townhomes would sit, how that quiet valley would look once it had been scraped clean of everything that made it hers. To him, it was already parking. It was already square footage. The porch and the wheat and the 46 years meant no more to him standing in her field than they had meant in his glass office. The heirs, too, were pleased with themselves. They had done a wild thing and gotten paid for it, and faced not a moment of consequence. And to 2 of them, that was simply proof of what they had always believed. That the rules were for other people, that money was a kind of armor nothing could get through, and that an old woman crying in a field was, at the end of the day, a story to be told over drinks. They laughed about it still. They played the video for people who hadn't seen it. But not all 3 of them were laughing. Somewhere apart from the others, alone, the quiet one sat with a phone in hand and watched that video again. Not to laugh at it. The sound was off. And there on the small screen played the whole of it once more. The trucks, the ruin, and the old woman going down on her hands and knees in the mud while the field came apart around her. The quiet one watched her fall and watched her reach for something in the dirt and did not look away. And the thing that had flickered across that young face in a room full of expensive drinks flickered again now, in the dark and alone. Only this time it did not pass. This time it stayed. And it began, slowly, to take the shape of a decision. It was late the next afternoon when Wanda heard it. She was out in the fields again, as she had been every day, down on her knees among the broken tomato plants with her gloves on and her back aching, doing the slow and hopeless work of trying to save a thing that could not be saved. She had, by then, given up on the phone call entirely. She had told herself the night before that she would hear nothing more, and a full day of silence had proved her right, and she had folded that small disappointment in with all the others and gone on. She was not thinking about the stranger or the napkin or anything at all beyond the plant in front of her and the ache in her knees. And so at first, when the sound came, she thought it was only her tired mind playing tricks. A low rumble, far off, at the very edge of the county, so distant it was more a feeling in the ground than a thing you could hear, a deep and steady murmur underneath the afternoon. She stopped, and she lifted her head, and she listened. It did not fade. It grew, slowly, steadily, the way a summer storm builds when it is still miles off and coming your way. The sound thickened and deepened and drew nearer, until there was no mistaking it for her imagination any longer. It was engines, many engines. And for one cold instant her heart seized, because the last time she had heard engines coming for her farm, they had come to destroy it. And she rose to her feet in the field with her muddy gloves and braced herself for whatever fresh cruelty was rolling up her road. She came around the side of the house, and she looked down the long gravel lane toward the county road, and she saw it. A single headlight, far off, turning onto the road that led to her valley. And then, behind it, another. And behind that one, 2 more. And behind those, more still. Headlight after headlight rounding that distant bend, more than she could count, a river of them pouring onto the road and pointing straight toward her farm. The rumble was a roar now, filling the whole valley, rolling up off the fields and echoing back from the ridge, and the horizon at the end of her lane simply filled. A line of motorcycles stretching back farther than she could see, chrome catching the late sun, 100 riders coming on in a slow and steady thunder that shook the still air of that quiet place. 100 of them, coming for her, Wanda stood at the foot of her own porch steps with one muddy glove pressed to her mouth, and she did not know whether to be afraid or to weep, and perhaps she was both at once. Because she understood, watching that impossible line of headlights come, that the stranger had not forgotten her after all. That 8 words on a telephone and a single text into the dark had reached out across 2 states and turned into this, into 100 men who did not know her name a day ago, riding through the afternoon toward a widow's ruined farm because one of their own had asked them to. And elsewhere in that valley, other people heard it too. The Heirs heard it. 2 of them had been lounging about, still pleased with themselves, still telling the story, and the sound reached them, that swelling thunder rolling in off the county road, and the words died in their mouths. The laughter that had come so easily to them for so long simply stopped. They went to a window. They looked out at that river of headlights pouring into the valley, and for the first time in their whole charmed lives, something moved through them that they had never once had cause to feel before. It was fear, real fear, the kind that money had never had to answer, and Prescott Vane heard it. He was near the property that afternoon, as he so often was now, walking the edge of the land he had already decided was his, plans rolled under his arm, a smile on his face, describing to whoever stood near him where the entrance road would go. And the rumble reached him, low and steady and growing, and he paused mid-sentence and lifted his head. He listened. He turned toward the sound, and down the long straight road he saw them coming. The headlights, the chrome, the 100 riders filling the horizon and bearing straight down on the very ground he stood upon. The smile went slowly off his face. The rolled plans hung forgotten at his side. Prescott Vane had spent his whole life believing that money could clean up any mess he made, that there was no problem it could not smooth over, no consequence it could not buy its way past, no wrong it could not quietly erase. In about 90 seconds, he was going to learn the one thing money cannot buy, and he was going to learn it in front of everyone. They came up the gravel lane slower than you would expect, and that slowness was its own kind of power. There was no wildness in it, none of the reckless roaring that the trucks had brought. This was something else entirely. 100 machines moving in disciplined order, rolling one after another onto Wanda's land and spreading out across it, and then, one by one, going still. Engines cut, kickstands dropped, and where a moment before there had been thunder enough to shake the ridge, now there was a silence so complete and so heavy that it pressed down on the whole valley. 100 men stood among their machines and said nothing at all. That was the thing that broke something loose in Prescott Vane. Not shouting, not threats, not raised fists, but that vast and patient silence. Because a man like Vane had spent his whole life in a world he understood, a world of leverage and pressure and quiet phone calls, a world where every problem had a price and every person had a weakness he could find and lean on. His power had never truly been his own. It was borrowed power, the power of important names, of lawyers on retainer, of the favors that flow between men who own things. And every ounce of it depended on the other person wanting something, wanting money, wanting to avoid trouble, wanting to keep what they had. But you cannot lean on a man who wants nothing from you. And these 100 men, standing silent on that ruined farm, wanted absolutely nothing that Prescott Vane had to give. Not his money, not his favors, not his goodwill. There was no lever to pull. There was no weakness to press. All his power, in that moment, simply evaporated, and he stood in the middle of a field he had called his own and understood for the very first time in his life that there are things in this world that money cannot reach. And then, from the midst of them, one man came forward. He was big, the way she remembered, arms like fence posts, gray in his beard now, moving with the unhurried certainty of a man who has never once in his life needed to hurry. And across the back of his worn leather vest were the patches Wanda had looked at 6 years ago on the side of a hot county road and never understood, the winged emblem and the stitched words she had never asked a single question about. She understood now what they meant. She understood who these men were. And she understood, standing on her porch with her hand pressed to her mouth, that the whole feared weight of it had come to her valley not to take anything from her, but to stand for her. He walked toward the porch, and he stopped, and he looked up at her, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all. And then he turned, so that he was facing not just her but all of them, the 100 silent men, and the pale-faced heirs at the window, and Prescott Vane frozen in the field with his forgotten plans hanging at his side. and he told them why he had come. He told them about a July afternoon 6 years back, and a broken-down motorcycle on the shoulder of a road, and a heat so bad the air had shimmered. He told them how car after car had slowed just enough to look at him, and then sped right back up. How 9 or 10 people had taken one look at the size of him and the patches on his back, and left him standing in the sun like he was something less than a man. And then he told them how one person had stopped. An old woman in a farm truck, who did not know him, who owed him nothing, who had every reason the others had to be afraid, and simply was not. He told them about the sandwich she had given him, and the cold water, and the 2 hours she had sat beside him on a tailgate in the shade and talked to him like he was anybody's neighbor. He told them she had never once asked what his patches meant. She had only seen a human being who needed help, and helped him. She didn't know who I was, he said, into that silence. Didn't care. Treated me like I mattered when nobody else would even roll their window down. That woman right there. And he looked back up at Wanda on her porch, 71 years old, and weeping now into her muddy glove. There's not a man standing here wouldn't burn the world down for her. And she never even knew it. If this is the part where you got chills, do her one favor. Share this video with one person who still believes good people shouldn't finish last. Prescott Vane had money and lawyers. She had one act of kindness she'd forgotten she ever did. Let's make sure hers is the story that gets told, not his. But if Prescott Vane believed that 100 silent men on a farm was the whole of what he had to fear, then he had badly misjudged what these people were, because they had not come only to stand on her land and frighten the guilty. Intimidation was the smallest part of it. What these men understood, in a way that the law in that county had refused to, was that the young men in the trucks had never been the real authors of what happened here. Somebody had pointed them at that farm. Somebody had put money in their hands, and they meant to find out who. They had been asking questions long before they ever rolled up that gravel lane. In the days it took to gather and to ride, quiet inquiries had been made across 2 states. A word here, a favor called in there, the sort of patient, dog digging that people underestimate right up until it arrives at their door. These were not men without resources of their own, and more than that, they were men that people talk to, men who hear the things that get said in the places the powerful never think to listen. And what they turned up, thread by thread, was a paper trail that led straight up out of the mud of Wanda's ruined field and into the glass office of Prescott Vane. Because a man like Vane could not resist doing things the tidy way. He had not simply handed cash across a table in the dark. He had made arrangements. There were the parcels he had been buying up for 2 years, every one of them a matter of record. And there at the center of the map, the single square he could not get, a widow's 120 acres standing between him and a fortune. There were the payments to 3 young people who had no business receiving money from a land developer, moving along channels that a determined person could follow. There were messages that ought never to have been sent, in which the whole ugly shape of the thing was laid out plainly. The land that needed clearing, the trucks, the promise that nobody would miss some dirt. Prescott Vane had spent his whole life keeping his own fingerprints clean by using other people's hands. But he had left prints all over this one, because it had never once crossed his mind that anyone with the will and the reach to find them would ever come looking on behalf of an old woman he considered beneath his notice. He had been wrong about that, the way he had been wrong about everything that mattered. And then there was the video. That video, the one the boy had filmed leaning out the truck window, grinning, of Wanda going down on her hands and knees in the mud while they laughed. The trophy they had passed around among their friends. The thing made for no other reason than to humiliate her, posted like a prize. It had been meant to be the final cruelty, the proof of how small and how helpless she was, a punchline to scroll past and forget. It became the thing that undid them all, because that video did not merely show 3 young men tearing up some dirt. Watched with clear eyes, it showed intent. It showed them seeing her. Seeing the old woman running and screaming and begging, and choosing not to stop. It showed the wave. It showed the laughter. It placed the trucks and the faces and the deliberate ruin beyond any lawyer's power to call it a misunderstanding about a boundary line. What the Heirs had filmed to shame Wanda was, in the end, a filmed confession, and laid alongside the money and the messages that led straight back to Prescott Vane. It turned the whole tidy arrangement into something no important name and no quiet phone call could smooth over. There is a bitter justice in it that you could not invent. The phone that had been held out a window to film a widow's worst moment now filmed the undoing of the men who ruined her. The trophy became the evidence. The cruelty became the proof. And everything Prescott Vane had built to keep his hands clean was about to be handed, in full, to people who could not be bought. And yet the thing that drove the final nail did not come from the 100 men on the farm, nor from the paper trail, nor even from the video. It came from inside Prescott Vane's own house. It came from the one place he never thought to guard. You will remember the third of them. The quiet one, who had not laughed quite as loud as the others in that room full of expensive drinks. The one on whose young face something had flickered and been pushed down, and then flickered again, alone in the dark, watching that video with the sound off and not looking away. That flicker had been growing all along, in the days while the others congratulated themselves, turning slowly, quietly, into a thing that could no longer be pushed down. And when it all came apart, that quiet one did the thing that none of them believed any of them capable of. He told the truth. He did not wait to be cornered. He did not lawyer up and go silent the way the family names would have counseled. He came forward on his own, and he laid the whole of it out. The drinks, the offer, the money, the way Prescott Vane had dressed a deliberate ruin up as a bit of harmless fun. He handed over the messages he still had. He confirmed, in his own words, that it had never been off-roading, never been an accident, never been some misunderstanding about a boundary line, that it had been a job, bought and paid for, aimed at an old woman on purpose by a man who wanted her land. Everything the powerful had worked to keep vague, the quiet one made plain. The betrayal, when it came from within the villain's own crew, and there was no smoothing that over. A man can buy silence, and buy lawyers, and buy the looking away of a whole county, but he cannot buy back a conscience once it has decided to speak. There is a hard grace in it worth sitting with. 2 of those 3 young men had learned nothing, and would answer for it. But the third, pulled along his whole life, going where the others went, had looked at what he had helped do to Wanda in the mud and had found, somewhere down beneath all that money and all that armor, a thing that money had never touched. He chose right, late, and at a cost, and against everyone around him. But he chose it. Even among the guilty, one of them chose her. After that, it came apart for Prescott Vane all at once, the way these things do once the first thread is pulled. The money, the messages, the video, and the testimony of one of his own hired hands landed together where no important name could hold them back. The arrangement he had built so carefully to keep his fingerprints clean was laid bare for everyone to see, and the county that had once looked away could look away no longer. His grand development collapsed with it. The parcels, the plans, the fortune he had been 2 years assembling. All of it fell apart around him, and his name, which had opened so many quiet doors, became the very thing that closed them. The man who had ruined a widow's farm from behind a desk was ruined in turn, and this time there was no one whose hands he could hide behind. The 2 heirs who had learned nothing learned something at last. For the first time in their charmed and consequence-free lives, the family names and the lawyers were not enough. They were made to answer for what they had done. Really answer, in a way that left a mark that would not wash off. And whatever came of it, they would never again believe, as they once had, that the rules were only for other people. But the part of this that Wanda would carry with her was not the fall of the men who wronged her. It was what came after, because the 100 men did not leave. They stayed, and the next morning, that ruined farm filled again with the sound of engines and effort. Only this time they had come to build. 100 men who owed her nothing set to work on her land, setting new fence posts where the old ones had been snapped, hauling and leveling and driving them deep the way Elwood once had, one by one down the low ground. They cleared the churned and broken earth. They righted the tomato rows and set new plants into the ground with surprising care in those enormous, weathered hands. And in the field where her husband's wheat had been torn to mud, they turned the soil and sowed it fresh, so that come the season it would stand green and gold again over the man who planted it first. It was the very image of that terrible dawn turned exactly backward, the same land, the same 100, the opposite meaning entirely. And the napkin, that soft, grease-stained napkin she had carried for 6 years, Wanda framed it and hung it in her kitchen. But not before the stranger took it up one last time, and, beside the number he had written all those years ago, at last wrote down his name. And so, in the end, it comes down to something very simple. Wanda gave a sandwich and a patch of shade to a stranger who could do nothing for her in return. No reward, no recognition, nothing but the quiet decency of stopping when everyone else drove past. She forgot she had ever done it. And 6 years later, that one small kindness came back to her 100 men strong. That is the only investment that has ever truly paid back like that. Not money, kindness, given without expecting a single thing in return. She stands on her porch now at dawn, the farm whole around her, the wheat coming up green and gold once more. And down at the gate, a single motorcycle idles in the rising sun, keeping watch, the way it always will. She fed one stranger who couldn't do a thing for her. It came back as 100. So if you believe the world still works that way, that the kindness you put out finds its way home, subscribe and stay with us. We tell the stories the smug and the cruel would rather you forget. Comment, kindness wins, if you made it to the end. I read every one.